All right. Okay. Tuesday stream, Magic Spell Studios. We got something a little bit different today. No Portal 2 today, but we wanted to try something a little bit new. As you know, in the past we've um, brought on guests to our stream, so we wanted to do that today even remotely. So everybody remembers me. I'm BC. I have John next to me, who you can actually see now. And John's going to introduce our guests.
Sam Camerata came to me in, I think, December, um, looking to do an independent study for production. And Sam is kind of famous for being a pioneer at RIT for um, getting sort of production centric education, and joined the School of Individualized Study from IGM at some point so that they could. Um, Sort of pinpoint the areas of focus that they wanted. Sam is a founding member of Esthetician Labs, which is a local Rochester independent game studio. They won awards for their game Crazy Plates sometime back, and continue to make cool stuff basically regularly. You should check out their game jam streams. They have like a very cool process for selecting the work that they do as a company, and I think that's super unique. Sam's interest in production is based on hands-on experience. So I was really excited when they reached out to me to do an independent study. I'm going to give it over to Sam now, but I was very grateful to be able to work with Sam, and think that they bring something totally unique as a sort of new-ish producer, but one who's kind of been doing it uh, before really even knowing that they were doing it. So very excited to hear what they have to say in their reflection today.
Pretending you don't know and haven't seen the presentation already. Haha.
Well, I haven't seen it fully presented. I've seen the outline.
That's fair. Hello, everyone. I'm not sure if you can see my face yet
I
because
think so,
I can't see
yes.
the stream. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Sam, like JV said. I am the producer at Esthetician Labs. And we'll dive into a little bit of my background and the studio's background once we get this presentation up and running. But am I good to start screen share?
I think you are, yeah. Go for it.
Cool.
There we go.
So yeah, feel free to jump in with any questions if you do have them. Otherwise, I'm just gonna go because I can't see anyone. So this is studying production for lack of a more interesting title. Just kind of a debrief about my independent study with JV. So first up, some personal context. I really, as a person, just love when classes assign like TED Talks and self-help style books. I think it's really interesting because it overlaps with a lot of what I read in my personal life, and I find that absurdly interesting. So a couple weeks back, towards the end of our independent study, I was watching Brene Brown's TED Talk called "The Power of Vulnerability," and to paint a picture for you, I was sitting there floored by about 3 minutes in, and it didn't stop until the talk was over about 20 minutes later. Um, there was this feeling of like, how have I not seen this yet? Because not only was it a TED Talk, it was an incredibly good one, but also this feeling of being seen and a little bit defensive, but also curious, and just this like, so where's the camera in my apartment? That sort of feeling. And I think that that says a lot about what I carried bringing into this semester in terms of my personal interests outside of production, which overlap a lot with production. So I watched the talk again the next week because I was a little too emotional about my personal life the first time I watched it in order to absorb much information. And a lot of the same emotions came up again, but this time in relationship to my company, which you see here. So Noah is on my left, Aiden is on my right. We form Esthetician Labs. I'll probably refer to us by our shorthand name, Ayla, frequently throughout the talk. We are a game studio cooperative. It's just the three of us, and we're located here in Rochester. As background, we did start our first game, Crazy Plates, back in 2017, and then formed Aesthetician Labs to kind of prop up that game and any future games in 2018. So we've been together a few years now. We operate primarily from this foundation of being friends who are putting in the work to show up for each other, to try and find some stability and some security by just doing what we love, which is making games. Or in my case, helping other people make games and doing some reflective work in the meantime. So I like to think that this talk, as we proceed, is going to highlight a lot of the things that I love about our team, our company, the values that we carry, as well as a lot of things that I love about my job in production, and a lot of the things that I didn't know coming into this, and a lot of the areas that I have to work on moving forward. So we're almost out of the introduction here. We're going to cover mostly some industry context, tools, methodologies, and some personal experiences, both from myself and from JV, and then delve into production as it related to my team, and some reflections on how everything I've learned applies specifically to this really small, cooperative, small team context. And a lot of this came out of this idea that classic production management and team management had failed me because I'd taken other classes in project management and such before that did not focus on a context that applied to me. And so trying to make all of this information come through the lens of what makes sense for my team and how can I use that realistically in the short term. So as we go through the presentation, we're going to talk about these two groups called production tools and people tools. That was for the sake of trying to come up with any sort of categorization. I developed these two sets, although I want to offer the disclaimer before we dive in that these names would be misleading if I didn't explain why I labeled them that way. And that was because they highlighted a really major misconception that I carried coming into the semester. I had always believed that people tools are like those soft skills, negotiation and conflict resolution, people management, vulnerability, and etc. Were distinctly separate from production tools, from the things that you learn and need to know to be an effective producer. And what this semester really highlighted for me is that that isn't at all the case, and that they are absolutely necessary tools to have in your tool bag as an effective producer, or else you won't be nearly as effective. We'll talk a lot more about that towards the end of the presentation when I start getting into the implications of everything I learned. But in the meantime, I want to dive into the content. So first off, the production tools, that hard, tangible stuff. Oh, and one more disclaimer real quick, that there's going to be so much here that I gloss right over because it would take a whole semester to explain the amount of content that we went over. My apologies for anything that you're like, oh, Sam, you didn't cover this. I only have so much time. But so first off, production tools. Kanban is this really highly visual way of organizing tasks into vertical lanes with cards that move along these lanes. It really seeks to maximize efficiency, and I learned that this was based out of its history coming from manufacturing, which I thought was really, really interesting. It emphasizes a lot of not having too many in-progress tasks for fear of not getting overwhelmed and not staying organized. It requires a lot of consistent, agreed-upon rules in order to stay organized. And it also requires a constant feedback and iteration on the workflow in order to seek that maximal efficiency. This was actually kind of one of the first tools that I was learning as a producer without knowing that it had an official name. I just jumped on Trello, which was a free tool that I was told was good. And so it was really interesting to kind of learn a little bit more about its background. Next, jumping into Agile, which is like a whole can of worms. But we used Agile game development with Scrum. We read most of the book, I would say. Mostly I wanted to touch on the Agile principles, which are just the statement of priority as to what an Agile team values and what it doesn't, or values less. So the four summary kind of principles here are individuals and interactions are valued higher than processes and tools. Working software is valued higher than comprehensive documentation. Customer collaboration is valued higher than contract negotiation. And then responding to change is more valuable than following a plan. My team has followed a lot of these principles for a very long time without knowing that they were formally organized. And I think that that was really interesting. Yeah. Moving right on through to Scrum, which in my mind was a little hard to separate, just a little bit, because the book that we were reading kind of ties the two of them together very nicely. But Scrum is this, it works following this idea of accountability loops, and follows the flow of information from backlogs through execution through these cycles that you return through over and over again. We talked a little bit about the role of a Scrum Master who facilitates the Scrum process and makes sure that everything is following the order that it is intended to. One of the biggest takeaways I took from this was this process of daily checking in. What have I done? What will I be doing until we meet the next time? And am I blocked on something? This amount of transparency is one of the key things, at least in my perception of Scrum, is to know where have we been, where are we going, and what stands in the way. And then just repeating that cycle and over, keeping your eyes both forward and backwards. And then last in this little category, we have lean, this idea of creating an organization that is very lean, for lack of a more creative term. It really values making new mistakes in order to learn new information, because if you're just making the same mistakes over and over, you are creating a lot of waste, which we'll touch on in just a second. Also creating only the minimum viable product, which is something that, if you're familiar with Aesthetician Labs, is something that we've always done. Creating a lot of very small prototypes to just test this one idea and not create a lot of extra work that postpones our learning. And it all really boiled down to, in my opinion, this idea of value versus waste, which is that any work you do will either produce value, it will produce learning, or else it will be wasteful. It either took you too long, you put in extra effort where it didn't need to be in order to get the intended output. Therefore, it should be avoided. And that brings us to kind of the part way through the semester break, where spring break happened. Early on in this category, the coronavirus also hit, which made a very good transitory phase into people tools, or that like soft stuff that, in my opinion, gets often dismissed as being unnecessary because it's not nearly as tangible. So first off, we talked about negotiation and conflict resolution. We used Getting to Yes as one of the pieces of content for this. And the four kind of pillars of Getting to Yes are this idea of trying on someone else's point of view, really trying to understand where it is that they're coming from. When you're finding a solution, making that solution a win-win. So rather than trying to leverage power such that one party can get it one over on the other one, finding a solution that matters to both people and that satisfies both people's needs. I believe the book used this idea of one person wanting the fruit of an orange, the other person wanting a rind, but the fact that they didn't communicate that meant that they both ended up with half of what they wanted because they came to the solution of just splitting the orange in half. But had they communicated more clearly, one person could have taken the whole rind, one person could have taken the whole fruit, and it would have been more of a win-win solution rather than a straight compromise. Third comes finding the subjective criteria, which JV and I talked about is one of the hardest things to do. Finding criteria that both parties agree upon and thinks is fair and objective. But it is one of the most valuable because it brings about this idea of mutual buy-in to whatever solution has come around to. And lastly is this mutual investment in solution creation. So just saying that both parties need to be active at the table when solutions are being generated and found upon, because otherwise you come up with this power imbalance and one party is likely to leave that negotiation table feeling pretty unsatisfied. Sorry, if I'm going too fast, please do slow me down or stop me.
No, you're good.
Next up came conflict resolution, and we talked about difficult conversations, the book. And so there was a lot of stuff here. I read this book a couple years ago when I was first getting started in production, and I thought that it was really good, and revisiting it only made it more helpful for me. First off is this idea of the 3 hidden conversations being what happened, what is each party feeling, and how does that relate to each party's identity. Those 3 conversations kind of need to be balanced in order to be non-threatening to each party. And with that also comes this idea of placing blame versus taking responsibility, which the first time I read this book was one of the most revolutionary concepts to me. Simply being that blame is this idea that you should feel bad about what you did, versus responsibility is I accept that I did something and accept that I need to take part in its resolution if it was something wrong. Otherwise, also this idea of using more curiosity and less persuasion. So when you're having kind of a conflict, this idea of if you are simply trying to persuade the other person, it becomes 2 people talking at a wall and neither person really listening. But if you can engage that curiosity, you begin listening to the other party, learning about what they need, and far more likely to result in a resolution that both parties are satisfied with. And lastly, this comes down to, in my opinion, the role of identity, which is one of those 3 hidden conversations, but I think also is a bit bigger than that. This role of identity being, what is the story that I tell myself about who I am? And how does this difficult conversation, in whatever context, interplay with that identity? So I might tell myself I am a really good producer, and then I make a mistake, and someone brings me to a conversation, a difficult conversation, that might kind of say to me that I'm not a great producer, right? And so recognizing that identity plays a role in these hard conversations, taking a responsibility, and having both parties be curious rather than defensive or persuasive, really helps that these difficult conversations go better. Next up, we have crisis management, which aligned really well with the coronavirus lockdown in the Rochester area. It was an incredibly interesting time to be talking about this. One of the big things that really came up is just how crucial transparency is. And that transparency includes a lot of things, including acknowledgement that the situation is going to be ever changing, especially if it's something like a pandemic, which none of us have lived through before and none of us have experienced. No one quite knows where the situation is going, and therefore being honest about that. And that harks on this idea of requiring honesty. Not being honest is not being transparent, and vice versa. And lastly, when you can be honest, when you can be transparent, and you can acknowledge the reality of the situation, that feeds your credibility and people's trust in you, all of which are incredibly important because people really want to feel in control during times of uncertainty. And that includes, yes, personal control over how people do their work, that person's sense of agency. But people are also looking for organizational control. So if I work for company X, I want to do my work for company X as best as I can and however I feel most comfortable. But I also am looking to company X to have organizational control and to indicate to me with transparency and with acknowledgement and honesty that they have control over the situation. So all of these things are very interrelated, and I see them as almost kind of a cycle. But I think that it can be really difficult, I think, for especially a large organization to prioritize these things because they also often have other things to worry about, like finances and whatnot. But it became really startlingly obvious to me just how important these things were as I watched some of these organizations like RIT deal with coronavirus as it was coming down the pipes. Next up, we have people management, and we used the managing humans as our kind of reference point. One of the big things that I took from this was this idea of producers as being referees. We kind of exist to bound the conversation. So coming into a meeting, for example, bounding what it is we are and are not focusing on during that meeting. And with that, making sure that we are being true referees in this game. So rather than getting in the way by stepping in, perhaps when teammates are having a conversation about a feature, right? Trying to toe the line between getting in the way of that conversation that needs to happen versus making sure that the game is being played safely and by rules that we all agreed upon. And so that kind of goes back to towing this line between and I, as the producer, keeping us in check, making sure that we are within our bounds while still making room for conversations that are productive. That was something that it's a very fun analogy to use when I'm in the middle of a meeting and feeling a little confused as to whether or not I should be pressing for us to move on or return to a topic. Is this idea of, is it getting in the way of our ultimate goal in this conversation? Or is it feeding it maybe just a little indirectly?
Hey, Sam, quick question.
Yeah.
So you had the producers as referees. I've also seen it as kind of the coach. I mean,
Yeah.
what would your take be on that?
Um, I think both of them work to some extent. I'm very not into sports, so
That's fair.
I might be sticking my foot in my mouth by saying this, but I think I really like the idea of referees because it kind of implies a little bit more impartiality, if that's a word.
Okay. Yep.
This idea that I am here to facilitate all parties like engaging equally, including myself. Like in a meeting, I need to be attentive that I am not kind of overstating my role, but also be sure that I feel like I have a voice and I have room to step in where I need to, versus a coach who not only is usually partial to one team, but also may or may not like find themselves being overbearing, underbearing, etc. I don't know. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. That's good. Thank you.
Glad to know my sense of sports is still up to date. Awesome. So next up, we talked about people's attitude management, otherwise known as morale. This was a topic that I grappled with for a few weeks because I found it very hard to grapple with, but ultimately came to this idea of low morale versus high morale. Low morale being that it comes from this lack of feelings of security, sense of value, and purpose. You'll very often see morale come out of those things, but from those sensations also comes the presence of emotions like anger, guilt, risk aversion tendencies, and a whole slew of other really difficult emotions. And all of that combines into being less engaged and being less connected to the people around you. If you're sitting there feeling worried about your job security, not feeling like you have a purpose with your work, and you're feeling angry, how likely are you to turn to the person at the desk next to you and engage with what they're doing and ask questions and ask for help? So it also hurts that interpersonal connection. Therefore, all of this comes back around and it snowballs. The less connected you are to your peers, the less likely you are to get help when you need it or give help when someone else needs it, which may cause more anger, more guilt, etc. And so on top of everything from an organizational standpoint, low morale is really detrimental to productivity and organizational efficiency. But
Sam,
on the
sorry, you got a question from the chat.
Sure.
That you grappled with this topic. Why was that?
So right now, Esthetician Labs is kind of in this crux point where two of our members, actually all three of us, formally graduate this week. And so we aren't financially sustainable right now. We're right on the cusp of that. But with that comes this idea of there is a lack of security, financial security at least, in this moment. And so I really wanted to kind of dig into morale. This was a topic that I chose because I wanted to understand a bit better what I could be doing to compensate for that, right? Because that lack of security isn't our choice, and we're doing everything that we can to make progress through it. And I had an intuition that that was going to hurt our morale. But what can I be doing as the producer? What can we as a team be doing collaboratively in order to avoid some of these detrimental effects of low morale? What can we be doing to compensate for that lack of security?
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. So on the flip side of low morale, we have this idea of high morale. And obviously, if low morale comes from this lack of security, this lack of sense of purpose and value, then high morale comes from the presence of those feelings. And it exists in the absence of anger and guilt and risk aversion. Some of those things might still be present, but I do believe that on the whole, you see exactly the opposite. That said, it still snowballs. And that is just simply because low morale, or high morale, I should say, begets engaged employees who are looking to help their neighbor, who are looking to contribute more value to the organization that they're working within. And that connection, that social connection, and that connection to the organization means that they are more likely to offer help to other people, ask for help when they need it, which just by virtue of interpersonal connection will help to spread that high morale, and it becomes almost contagious, but in a good way. And last up, we have my favorite topic, I think, of all of these, if I had to pick one, which was Brene Brown's TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability. There was so much to dig into here. But the biggest kind of takeaway here was that vulnerability is an absolute necessity for personal fulfillment and connection. Connection also requires this idea of authenticity, which really struck a chord for me because it is authenticity personally with just kind of being human and exposing that, but also professionally. And so making sure that your peers know what you feel professionally as transparently as possible. There was a lot here that spoke to me, but one of the big things was how we numb vulnerability, because it opens us up to this idea of being threatened, right? If I expose that I failed in something, that makes room for people to come in and say, yes, you did fail, and make me feel worse. But one of the biggest things as producers is this practicing acknowledgement of my failures, because it makes sure that my team has room to acknowledge their failures as well. For a lot of people, I think in modern society, at least Western society, this idea of failure is bad is very pervasive. But one of the most valuable things I think I've been able to work on as a producer is making room for failure. And that goes back to this idea of blame versus responsibility. Failure is, if you aren't blaming people for failure, then it doesn't become something that you need to be defensive about. It is something that you take responsibility for and make room for, and then learn through and move past. And as it comes to vulnerability, there's also this really awesome idea that JV brought up. The games industry is a really generally uncertain place to be working in right now. We are still a relatively young industry. A lot of the studios, like larger studios that I see people going to work in, frequently experience layoffs and financial insecurity. And so the idea that we need to be extra vulnerable in order to help compensate for that uncertainty and to make room for that uncertainty was really, really big for me. So now that we got through all like the content, this is where we kind of dig into the juicy stuff, the implications, and where I found the value. So as we talk about those production tools, those more hard topics, one of the big things, and I think the most overarching of everything, is that those topics aren't nearly as rigid as I thought they were. I can take bits and pieces from all of these different tools and frameworks that we talked about, and apply the parts that fit my context and leave the parts that don't. And so I kind of want to touch on the bits that I think do fit us, including Agile's statement of priorities. Like I said, we've been following a lot of these since the beginning of Aesthetician Labs without me really knowing them formally. That said, it really highlighted to me that there is a lot of value in revisiting our values regularly, revisiting our priorities regularly, in order to help us stay focused with our core mission, despite this time of fluctuation and uncertainty that I was talking about. Another few things that I took away was this idea of lean's value versus waste. We specifically create games right now in the hyper casual market. So a lot of those really, really small mobile games that you see. And this idea that our market requires such nimbleness and efficiency really highlights the value of value versus waste, and being sure that we are constantly mindful that the work we are doing produces value and isn't wasteful, because all of our time is important and is critical. Third off, and I don't think I touched too much on this, but this idea of the value of knowledge. We haven't achieved financial stability quite yet, but we have, over the 2.5 years that we have been making games together, and 2 years that we've been in business, we have developed a tremendous bank of knowledge about how to make games, especially in the hyper casual market, how to develop games that fit our segment of the market really well. And by virtue of having accrued all this knowledge, we've created a lot of value for ourselves. We as a team are valuable because we have learned so much that a new team to this segment of the market wouldn't know. Therefore, knowing that this is kind of our exploit, this is what we need to leverage in order to find our way to stability as a team, really became, it felt really obvious in the moment, but the longer I kind of sat with this idea, it became more and more potent for me. Next up, in the Agile development with Scrum, they talked about kind of what constitutes a great team. And you'll see here some of the things that they listed: a shared vision and purpose, complements to each other's skills, room for safe and open communication, sharing decision-making responsibility and accountability, having fun. I think every single thing in this list is something that we have as a team and that we've had from the beginning. And so I've had a couple of people throughout Ayla's couple of years of being together ask why we think we work together so well and why we've found the success that we have. And I think this list really just summarized all of the wonderful traits that I think that we have. And it felt really good to look at this list and say, I think there's always room for development, but I think at our foundation, we have all of these things. And so not a key takeaway in terms of action items, but just a key takeaway in terms of recognizing where we are. It felt really good to see these. And then last but not least, we have started, actually since the beginning of this semester, implementing these Scrum style stand-ups. On days that we don't meet together via video call, we'll actually do these via Discord chat. And then when we do meet together in person, we always have a vocal stand-up. And I have found that so tremendously helpful. And I think Noah and Aiden have as well. This idea of, I can always go into our production tools and see what work they've done. But vocally checking in and someone being able to elaborate a little bit further, say, yes, I did do this thing, and here's where I ran into some issues. Maybe we can fix it this way. We don't follow a precisely Scrum, like minimalist approach to these stand-ups, but it makes so much more room for frequent check-ins that I think it's earned its place as a really valuable implication of this independent study on the whole.
Quick question about those, Sam.
Yeah.
Do you find yourself with stand-ups, sometimes, and I'm kind of speaking from personal experience here, like, oh, I have something I want to run by somebody, I'll save it for stand-up because discussing it in person will be more fluid than like maybe doing it over Discord or email or something. Do you find yourself saving those little tasks or those little discussions for stand-up?
Absolutely. And I think even more than that, we save them specifically for meetings when we are chatting either via voice or in person. Because we do some of the stand-ups just via like Discord chat. And I do think that there's things that just aren't particularly suited for that. So I do find myself, but I also think I occasionally see Noah and Aiden doing this as well. Yeah.
Cool.
Cool. So then talking about some of the implications of these like softer skills that we talked about. And I go category by category for these just because there was a lot. Negotiation and conflict resolution. This idea that finding objective criteria is really hard, but it is worth the difficulty and worth the extra effort in order to go through with it. We talked about, so as an example of this, at the end of 2019, I went ahead and I structured kind of peer reviews for Aesthetician Labs. We don't have like a hierarchy, so it wasn't a performance review per se, but it was more like we each kind of gave each other a peer review and said, here's where you're doing really well, here's where you have room for improvement. And that was the first time that we'd ever done something formally like that. And I wanted to make it as non-threatening as was possible, but also as valuable as possible, because I like to think that we as a team have very open communication outside of these formal sitting periods. So we worked a little bit beforehand to develop these criteria that through which we were actually looking at. And despite the fact that it was kind of a hard conversation to initiate, I think that it ended up being overall the whole process, but also the process of developing those criteria was really important to say. When you come up with bullet points about room for improvement, try to bring examples to the table, reinforcing this idea that we were all on a level playing field when we brought critique to the table was really, really valuable. Next up from negotiation and conflict resolution was both parties need agency when creating solutions. I don't know why this felt so revolutionary, but it did. And I think within Aesthetician Labs, this is more implied than anything, because we are all, it is a cooperative, we all own equal shares, we all have an equal stake in product that we are making and in how the team runs. But this idea of just making sure that everyone is invested from the beginning and everyone gets a voice when we make decisions was really important. And last but not least, this was a bit more on the personal side, but just employing more curiosity when going into these negotiations. I definitely, speaking from experience, have some tendencies to go into persuasion mode, and recognizing just how much that can impede progress and good resolutions to problems is something that I really want to take away from this.
You mentioned the peer reviews.
Yeah.
That, to me, immediately what jumps to mind is the opportunity for vulnerability there.
Yep.
Like that's especially with if you're on a team where you were previously friends, like you mentioned you were. So that seems huge. Like that seems really cool.
That's a connection that I absolutely did not make, but I think it harks on like, I think it really helps me to understand why it felt kind of nerve-wracking at the time. Like as I went into it, and as all three of us went into the conversation that day that we actually did the peer reviews, there was like an air of nervousness that I don't think I've ever seen within our team before.
Right.
And I think it's precisely that. It's while we have always been engaging in very open communication, I very intentionally opened this door for vulnerability, and Noah and Aiden, kudos to them, stepped through it, with excitement with me. But it's just that we never made such a conscious space for that vulnerability.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool. So then talking about crisis management, despite the fact that we are in a pandemic right now, Ayla itself and our segment of the market, I would say, is not particularly experiencing a crisis in the same way that like a restaurant or an in-person brick and mortar organization would. That said, it just really reflects this need for an abundance of very careful communication. Personally, I know when communication becomes more critical and I need to be more careful, I either go towards just completely clamming up, just like I don't want to say anything wrong, so I'm just not going to say anything at all. Or I just need to be really open and communicate a lot, and therefore kind of have this tendency to be less mindful. Recognizing that dichotomy was a really productive step that came out of that week or two of communication and that topic. But something that I want to practice a little bit more, especially as we go through the rest of the coronavirus and into whatever comes next. So then came people management, which, as we mentioned, like I just have been using that analogy of producers as referees frequently when I'm in meetings, and just kind of having that internal debate during a conversation of, is this relevant? Should I step in? Just because I'm managing a really small team, you know, often if I'm not engaged in the conversation, it's just Noah and Aiden. It's only two people. But just that small team size doesn't mean I'm not still the referee. And just because it's two very close friends of mine doesn't mean that I'm not the referee. I still have to recognize that analogy as being true to any size context. And then morale. And we touched on this a little bit already, but we are in a time with unavoidable uncertainty. And even though security is low, we can still be fostering a lot of high morale by having the sense of purpose and value of those three kind of core pillars. We still have two of them. And then just having that clear and open communication about hard emotions that may come up, and that kind of touches on vulnerability as well. Making room for social connection, value, and purpose can, as much as possible, compensate for that uncertainty as we find our way towards certainty. That's kind of our goal right now. And so last but not least at all, vulnerability came up. Games being inherently uncertain was a really productive thing for me to recognize. Just to say that, like, I, as a person, really value certainty. I really value security. But recognizing that I've chosen to enter an industry where I have to kind of embrace that discomfort a little bit is really, I think, going to be a key for me personally finding fulfillment and contentment within the work that I'm doing. And then as a company, embracing that uncertainty rather than like grudgingly accepting it. Like, if we have to be okay with it, let's lean into that. And I think Ayla as a whole has done a really good job of that. I think Noah and Aiden have counterbalanced my craving for certainty in a really positive way. Because Ayla's whole history is of doing uncertain things. We have applied for a lot of opportunities that were not certain. Just purely by the fact that we engaged in entrepreneurship while we were still in college and trying to make it financially soluble is uncertain and a bit vulnerable. And in that sense, I really am grateful to my teammates for kind of pushing me towards that. Because I think personally, if it were just up to me, I don't think I would have gone out on such a limb. So there are more implications. Don't think it's over. These are the even kind of juicier bits that weren't officially part of the class's curriculum, but I think were valuable to talk about regardless. And I'll breeze through these because some of them are more relevant than others. But in teaching and in production, having flexibility and compassion at the forefront is absolutely critical. JV and I initially, like at the start of the semester, had plans to do interviews with some studios at GDC, and I was organizing interviews and, you know, just about to start getting things scheduled when the coronavirus came down the pipes. And aside from, you know, the impending threat of a pandemic, I also had to kind of grieve a little bit for this opportunity that I had banked on, and all of this awesome information that I was really looking forward to getting to obtain and kind of talk about people with. The flexibility and compassion that JV brought forward was incredibly helpful in kind of helping me to process all of that in a very tumultuous time. And I'm super grateful for that. And I think it really helped me to recognize compassion is always at the forefront of kind of how I approach things, but being on the receiving end of that was just so, it was very, very potent for me, for lack of a better term. Next up came kind of this value of consistent note-taking and note storage and accessibility. Our first meeting during the independent study, JV wrote out for me on a whiteboard exactly how the emails that come after each meeting should be laid out. And we kind of established some norms for those notes. And there were certain weeks when I did not want to send those notes. not in a timely manner, not in that format, but I found the longer the production studio went on or the independent study went on, the more I was so grateful that we established those norms and I held myself to those norms and JV held me to those norms, because as I was making this presentation and as I'm trying to synthesize all of this information, having like accessible records of what happened and what we were thinking was incredible. Absolutely something that I really like. I always like taking notes, but having consistent formatting and everything was just like chef's kiss. That was so, so good.
And producers often end up being team historians to a degree and being able to reference, for example, a past retrospective or something like that. Like, what did we say we were going to do a month ago? Did we do that? Yeah, I think that's a really great tool and habit to build for a bunch of different reasons.
And you see that. So Ayla, during our 2019 kind of end of year review, we did peer reviews, but we also set some goals for 2020, which was kind of a new process for us. We set formal goals, we laid them out. And so we've been revisiting those periodically, and I have a format that I follow for those, and I have a place where I know that they live in our Google Drive. And the value of simply having that on record holds us a lot more accountable than if we didn't take notes of them or didn't know where to find those notes. And last but not least on this slide is this idea of self-guided learning. RIT has such a wealth of information, including everything, including project management. That said, a lot of those project management classes and a lot of the related classes just didn't serve the specific information that I was looking for. And so having a resource like JV was impeccably helpful in terms of not only someone to help guide me through the learning process, but also to loan me his expertise. And it's probably one of the most valuable and applicable classes to Aesthetician Labs that I've taken in my 3 years since we've started the business. And here's just a couple quotes that came up throughout the semester that I think are very worthwhile to talk about. One of which being production problems are people problems. And a joking, mostly, result of that was my idea that all producers should be in therapy. Because if production problems are people problems, and we need help processing those people problems in order to do that healthfully, therapy is a great place for that. Obviously, it's not for everyone, and I say this very jokingly, but I do think I have thoroughly come to believe that this idea of production problems are people problems, and that harks back to that. I made the distinction throughout the whole presentation between production tools and people tools. And production problems are people problems highlights just how wrong that distinction was in my mind when I came here. And this other quote, plans are useless, but planning is crucial. In Aesthetician Labs, and I think generally in production, things more frequently than not don't go according to plan. But that doesn't mean that creating your plan is a waste of time. One of my biggest insecurities as a producer is this idea of, if the plan doesn't go how we planned it, is the value I bring to the team as someone who helps us to plan, is that valuable? But recognizing this quote and internalizing this quote, I think is a really potent counter to that, this idea that just because it doesn't go according to plan doesn't mean that the process of planning itself wasn't helpful and isn't necessary and isn't valued. I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of expectations versus reality by virtue of being more tangible. Production tools can be potentially picked up more quickly and more easily. That said, both production tools and people tools of my made up categories need to be imbalanced, and they need to be learned and practiced in order to be a strong producer. This independent study was really my first formal step towards mastering the hard skills, the production tools side of things. And I admittedly didn't pick up a large swath of the things that we went over because we tried to cover so much ground, but it gave me the framework to understand at a base level all of these things and enhance my learning wherever I needed to, and enhance my curiosity to learn those things moving forward. And also this overarching theme of the role of process. Process is a system that makes hard and complicated things repeatable. That is something that John harped on me a lot throughout the semester, and I absolutely agree and appreciate. Um, all of production is simply a process, but the process isn't the point. Um, Simply getting wrapped up in the process is only counterintuitive to creating games, to creating whatever it is that comes at the end result of your product. That very intentional and mindful application of process, of production tools, is what keeps it from getting in the way. That reflection, that intentionality. And I just kind of wanted to wrap up the formal presentation part of this with a quote from Brené's Brown Talk, because I thought that this was really potent. To let ourselves be seen, deeply seen, and vulnerably seen. To love with our whole hearts, even though it's no guarantee. To practice gratitude and joy in those moments of terror when you're wondering, can I believe in this so passionately? Can I be this fierce about this? Just to be able to stop and instead of catastrophizing what might happen, to say, I am so grateful because to feel this vulnerable means I'm alive. Ayla, as a whole 2.5 year journey at this point, has been very challenging to my want for security, um, to a lot of the personal habits that I have, like defensiveness, like persuasion. Uh, and it has forced me to be vulnerable in ways that I couldn't have imagined 2 years ago, even a year ago. Um, and so learning to practice gratitude and embrace the fear that sometimes comes from the situations that entrepreneurship has put me in is something that I'm still learning to this day, but has been one of the most valuable lessons that I've learned. And I really appreciate people like both BC and John have kind of encouraged me to pursue and supported me in pursuing and supported our whole team. So that is the presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was great.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
I have some more questions.
Yeah.
Um, so let's see here. One one of the ones earlier on was differentiating between production tools, Agile, Scrum, and this is one I still
Yeah.
struggle with. And as I'm starting to go down that road, like how you mentioned a little bit, I think you did, like you kind of saw them as all either lumped together or either ors, but you mentioned you can kind of take parts from them and make what works for you. Could you talk a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think with a lot of the like softer skills, those people tools that I was kind of clumping together, um, it's a lot harder to take bits and pieces, I think, because they are less tangible items. They are less definitive things, and they are a lot more subjective. So I think it applies a little bit less there. Although obviously, when you talk about something like vulnerability, someone might only be ready to embrace bits and pieces of those principles. But when it comes to those harder tools, those tangible tools, um, of the I think formal 12 agile principles, um, only 10 of them might really be applicable to where Ayla is now and might be values that we hold as an organization. Um, that doesn't mean that the whole thing is garbage and we
Right.
shouldn't apply any of them. It just
Right.
means that these are the 10 that we need to really be mindful of. And then as we grow, revisit those other two occasionally and see if they align with us and see if they are something that we want to bring into our fold.
Now, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think all of those tools are scalable. So
Okay.
the idea of lean organizations, of agile, of Scrum, those all scale, and they might look different in application for a team of 20 than they do for a team of 3.
Right.
But recognizing which parts are the most valuable to a team of 2 or 3 and saying these are what we're going to take for now is something that I kind of didn't really see room for early on, and I kind of developed my viewpoint as the semester went on.
Cool. Makes sense. Another question I had, and John, feel free to jump into if you have any takes on this as well. But working working with a team that is friends. It's easy when you have a job and you leave your job and you're like, okay, I'm not the producer anymore. I'm going home. But when it's friends and it's people you're close with, how do you manage that? Like, okay, are we just having a friend discussion right now, or should I tiptoe into producer Sam? Um, because I imagine there will be some people who hear this and are like, oh, I want to start up, a game with some friends. And if one of them are leaning towards a producer role, how they manage that, because it sounds like it can be tricky.
I think this is an incredibly potent question for me, and it's something that I've grappled with since very early on. Because full transparency, Noah's right back there. We live together.
Yeah,
Um,
he's got noise canceling headphones.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah.
no, it is hard. Like, I'd be lying to say that it was something that we navigated early on and have conquered. No, it's a constant problem.
Yeah.
But we as a group of three get together for beers and dinner occasionally, just for fun, and have game nights. And there's always this very mild tension, I would say, of we are in personal time. Do we avoid work topics? Do we avoid talking about our work? Do we make room for that and just kind of entertain it and let it pass? I think we as a group dynamic have embraced the make a little room for it and then move on. Like, this is
Right.
this is our leisure time. Our work is our passion, and we're all very excited about it, especially right now. But despite making room for it, like, we're here to have a good time, and there is a time and a place for work.
Right.
I think part of that came from the three of us each independently developing some work-life balance, which I know other game developers my age, who I know from RIT, that is a skill that some people have developed more than others. We as a team had to learn that very early on, because we have been doing this as a group for a while. I'm not sure if that answers your question more than highlights that it's a good question.
To relate it back to some of the topics, I think there are a bunch of things that make it challenging, and you outlined some of them. And I think you're with a team of coworkers who are also friends, who are also founders. There are a lot of interwoven identity issues there, like what is my identity as a producer? What's my identity as a coworker? What's my identity as a partner? What's my identity um, as a co-founder? I think that you're building a house, an identity house of cards in some situations, and if you're not really mindful of that and working, building a lot of tools and skills to work around that, it can be. I see often, especially with student teams that also are friends. You're introducing a lot of challenging conflict topics that they might not otherwise have come into contact with so early in their careers.
There was a time, I think it was within probably the first year, that we were working on as a team, because it was actually while we were working on Crazy Plates. There was a time early on when I was still understanding what a producer did, because I didn't have anyone like JV. I didn't have anyone that I knew who was doing games production at the time. So I had very little idea of what am I doing? What does our team need from a producer? What does a producer with a larger team even do? Like, I didn't really have any reference points. And so I was kind of running around blind at that point. I was just like, within our team, as some context for anyone who doesn't know, for me, a producer is all of these like kind of team management tools, as well as everything else that Noah and Aiden don't necessarily have time for. So I do a lot of like office management type work as well, and I do other stuff. So at a point in Crazy Plates, we needed a trailer video for some event, and that got put on me because Aiden's over here working on the abundance of art assets that we needed, and Noah was over here programming, and neither of them had time. So I was like, well, I've got this. And then because video editing and that whole thing, I didn't know anything about the software that I needed, about the process. I was really scared of failure because it was so intertwined with my identity to like show up at that point. I was so insecure about my role that I like didn't want to fail because I didn't want to seem invaluable. I procrastinated that task until it was too late. and it became a huge problem. And it introduced a lot of conflict, and it was conflict that came up in my home life. It followed me home for weeks because we are friends, we are partners, we are, our relationships cross the boundaries of personal life and work life. It challenged my identity a lot. And so that was kind of my first big failure, I think, as a producer, and it was one that I took a lot from. But it harps on a lot of these topics, and it taught me some of the room for more personal, like soft skills, and the role that they need to play for me to be an effective person in my role.
Right. I think, speaking from personal experience, when I first started working at Magic, I had already spooled up Rock Game Dev, and I would get questions from people in the community, and I would just out loud say, okay, speaking as Rock Game Dev Rob, or Magic Rob, and that was like first initial step. But then after that came the, okay, well, how am I reacting to this? Like, how am I internalizing my reactions or thinking about the opinion I'm going to form? Like, I can have two different opinions on something based on the different roles I lead and you lead, and that's still something that I struggle with all the time. I have a knee-jerk reaction. I'm like, all right, which one am I reacting to, or which version of me is reacting to that? And that's tricky. It's very tricky.
Fortunately, I think because Acetician Labs, it is only the three of us, and we all co-founded. We all have an equal stake in the creation and fulfillment of our values as a team. Very rarely is my opinion on something as a producer different than my opinion on something as an individual. If someone's like, hey, I'm not going to finish these tasks because I'm exhausted, or I feel like I might be coming down with something, or anything else, like those opinions are very rarely in conflict with each other. I think for me, it's more just, where am I making the mental space to put on my producer hat, and where am I defaulting to my personal hat?
Yeah, I like that.
But I can absolutely see how, like, especially if you're with larger organizations, one or both, where that comes into play.
Oh, I had something else, but I forgot it. And it's not one of the things I wrote down. It was something about vulnerability. I like that topic though. That's I'm just gonna start talking and see if it comes back to me. Um, there, it has your take on what vulnerability is changed as you've practiced it. Like, I think my initial reaction to, if I were to think, okay, I need to be more vulnerable, it'd be just talking more and talking through maybe my thoughts and my opinions. Um, and I could see that maybe changing over time as I learn how to better be vulnerable. Have you seen that with yourself as both a producer, teammate? Um, like, what vulnerable means to have changed over time as you've practiced it more? I think you're muted.
Oh, I was hitting the wrong button. Yes, although I think exactly how is a little hard to elaborate. It's escaping me a little bit. But generally speaking, I think in my personal life, I think vulnerability has morphed from this, like, amorphous blob of talk more into talk with intention about the things that scare me.
Okay.
Make room for critique, because avoiding critique is like something that I employed heavily up until rather recently, when I started doing some of that vulnerability work. More professionally, as we start talking about kind of how that applies to Acetician Labs and being a producer, vulnerability is a lot less of saying, I feel this way and I think you might disagree, and more of saying, I don't know. Okay. And saying, like, I don't have that answer, or I'm not prepared to handle that right this minute. There's times when, like, a task will roll across my desk, and by virtue of being a producer, I kind of accept more of a role of, like, yeah, okay, our app might get approved at 9 p.m. and our team expects this to be sent to our publisher today, right, and therefore I need to do some work at 9 p.m. occasionally. Yeah. vulnerability for my role has sometimes looked like me saying, I don't want to do that, and then proceeding whether or not I do it. But just saying that and making
Right.
room to say that is sometimes a place of vulnerability. And there's so many other examples. But I do think it looks a little different. And quite honestly, in Ayla, application of vulnerability didn't really make way through my head until
Mhm.
very recently, until I was doing vulnerability work in my personal life and we started talking about it in this independent study.
Yeah, one thing we focused on a lot, maybe indirectly during the study, was breaking down the barriers between um, sort of like we talked about, like with the identities. I don't know if you've ever heard of like offices where they have like signs, like we check our emotions at the door and stuff like that. And I think that the more research that's done and the more topics like vulnerability become um, less stigmatized, the more
Yeah.
stuff like that just is absurd. Like we all know that that's not possible to check our emotions. Our emotions are tools that we
Yeah.
have for interacting with the world around us, and they're a part of what makes us tick. And I think um, I think I really want to emphasize that um, they're I mean, I'm literally working from home right now in a pandemic. The personal me and work me is less and less of a thing
Mhm.
in light of that reality. And so I think that crisis can help expose things that are already true about our worlds. And so I like the idea of just dropping that pretense.
Well, and this idea of checking your emotions at the door, if you tie that back to morale, even and connection and interpersonal connection in the workplace, creating fulfillment and creating employee engagement. Like, you can't have engaged employees who care about each other and care about the greater work being achieved within an organization unless you have people who are emotionally invested in the work being done and the people that they're working with.
Another thing we spent some time focusing on was sort of a self-conscious defensiveness about some of these topics, where it was like, okay, let's define what morale is. Let's quantify what the impact of high morale is. Like, what do we think about that? Because in the back of my head, I'm thinking, okay, some grumpy executive could be asking me, why does this matter? Um, and I think the sort of stuff we talked about is well, you have to be vulnerable in order to say we're behind schedule.
Yep.
Like how many different, like that's a thing that a producer has to say a lot. Um, I don't think a lot of producers get to say we're we're totally running smoothly all the time. That's just not the job. That's not games.
And
Um,
like with Ayla setting our goals periodically and revisiting them, it's my job to make sure that we are revisiting them. And very frequently, we don't meet our goals. And it is up to me as the person who keeps us on track and like keeps us accountable to those goals. It's my job to step forward and say, hey, we didn't meet these goals and we have failed in these ways. That is absolutely a place of vulnerability for sure.
But that you also mentioned the point of what was it, responsibility versus blame? Am I getting that
Yep.
right? With failure, which I find interesting because uh, just like you know, I like stability, and that can lead to, kind of shooting the straight and narrow, keeping it safe, not taking risks because that fear of failure. Um, where it felt like what you were talking about was a little bit like, okay, instead of focusing on blame, it was focused on responsibility. Am I getting that right? Where it was like,
Yeah.
why did this? Like, you don't need to feel bad that you failed, but what was the responsibility associated with it?
Yeah, I think personally this came up a lot and it was something I work on, but it also came up in Ayla a lot, like with that video production example.
Mm,
This idea of, yes, I did something objectively bad or objectively not aligned with our goals as an organization or whatnot. Um, there might be a component of needing to feel bad in order to kind of internalize that lesson. But wallowing in that blame and like
yeah,
getting crushed by that blame is so counterproductive. And rather than focusing on that blame, focusing on, okay, it is my responsibility to have that done and it's not done. Why didn't it get done? And how can I take responsibility responsibility for it moving forward? What do I need to change in order to make room for this task to get done or to handle this in a more productive way,
Right.
et cetera, and so on. And so for me, it meant asking for help, even just finding tools in that video example. But it also meant confronting discomfort, which was something that I needed help with as well. And that's where stuff like therapy comes into play.
It
Yeah, and
it sounds.
with blame also, blame is superficial. Blame is trying to decide who did it, and contributions or responsibility is saying how did it happen. And I think a producer's job is often to help diagnose problems and ensure they don't happen again. And if all you're doing is saying who caused it, you're not actually exposing all the little other contributions. There are the tools like the 5 whys, for example, that are designed to get you past that first layer of blame and to dig deeper. And we didn't really dig into that, but yeah, I do think that's one aspect of blame, and the other I think is that it also creates a fear culture, which I
Yep.
think is I think fear is if your intent is to make someone fearful of messing up, I think that's also kind of abusive. And if you're talking about open, vulnerable cultures where people are psychologically safe and can can do these things, you have to avoid that.
And it also blame seems to encourage that self-fulfilling prophecy cycle of, okay, well, I'm just not good at this, so I'm not going to do it, so I'll just ignore it, and it's just a repeat. I mean, that gets overlaid on everything you might have to do just because you feel uncomfortable at doing it. So yeah.
Right.
Blame also overlaps a lot with this idea of reinforcing like unproductive identities. It's like,
Mm,
oh, either I am the person who did this wrong and I'm terrible and I don't have any worth, or I am not to blame, even though I had responsibility. Like, we're going to shoot right past that and say that, like, I don't have any part in this, I'm not to blame. And therefore, reinforcing like a false sense of identity that isn't productive to getting anything done well in the future.
right. I like it. Love it. It's good stuff. Stuff that I didn't know before this talk.
Hell yeah.
Cool.
Cool.
I don't have any more questions, but that was great. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Yeah. John, anything? You got
Nope.
anything? No?
Nope. Just proud of you, Sam. Great job.
Thank you. Thank you for a great semester.
Yeah, it's a good time. John, I just like to point out how Lou sits behind you and just stares at you, and we can see.
He's been a nightmare this whole talk. I don't know.
Just,
I don't know if I like forgot to feed him or what, but he's
just
just being a nightmare.
multiple times throughout this, he's just sat there and stared at the back of your head.
Yeah, and he's yelling at me. I had my mic off. Thank
Oh,
goodness.
gosh, cats. They love us and hate us? Question mark. I don't know.
What a nerd.
Awesome. Well, thanks. This was a lot of fun. This will wrap up our stream for today. Um, John and I will be back to playing Portal 2 on Friday. But yeah, we would like to do this once, things potentially maybe go back to normal. We would like to have other guests. Really appreciate you, Sam, for coming on and talking about the good things that you've done.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll be back on Friday. Thanks everybody for hanging in the stream and asking questions. That's it. All right. See you guys.
Bye forever.
Bye.
Goodbye.